good to be with you this morning. It's good to see the number of folks that have chosen to come to this worship service this morning. You see the topic of the message this morning. It's a topic that I've pondered much of late. It was pondered much in the Old Testament. It was pondered much in the New Testament. There's a book in the Old Testament called Lamentations. In chapter 3 of that, from a song that we sing, or at least we hear this from a song that we sing in our hymnal, it says, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him." The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. You know, when we sing that song, I visualize myself on some cottage on a mountain overlooking a stream and how wonderful it is. And I say, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. But you know, the guy who's writing that is a prophet named Jeremiah. He's not looking at a mountainside scene. He's not looking at a brook. He's looking at a destroyed city in the city of Jerusalem. And in the book of Lamentations, he's lamenting the fact that that city has been destroyed. That God apparently is on the other side for a while. That God is punishing his own people. And the first 3 or 4 chapters bear that out. But in the midst of this, he says that the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. What would possess him to say that? Why would he say that? You know, sometimes in the midst of our struggling and our suffering, we deal with sorrow and despair and pain that's so deep, it's hard to get through. Just like Jeremiah was trying to process there. You know, a while back, had a relative who's very close to me, a direct descendant of mine, gave me a book. And this was probably 2.5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, when she was dealing through a period of great suffering. And I didn't read that book for a couple of years because I didn't feel the same level of pain, and maybe I didn't need any treatment to that pain or any way to deal with that pain, or at least I didn't think I did. And I started reading that book, and I have over the last 6 months, and it deals specifically with the value of lament. And it takes most of its study from the book of Psalms. And it kind of changed the way I think about things. It opened up my eyes to things that I never had my eyes opened up to before. I didn't really even know that was in the Bible, to be honest with you. I didn't know people talked to God this way. I didn't know they conversed with God this way. And I certainly didn't know the value of conversing with God this way. So this morning for a while we're going to talk about the value of communicating our pain to God. And we read a portion of this earlier. We'll read it again. In Psalm, the 77th chapter, verse 1, the Bible says, "I cried out to God and with my voice, to God with my voice, and he gave ear to me. In the day of my trouble, I sought the Lord. My hand was stretched out in the night without ceasing." He's in a prayer posture, is he not? Or at least a prayer posture. We don't see it here very often, but he's praying to God. He's somebody who's searching desperately for God. He wants God to be a party to his pain. "My hand was stretched out in the night without ceasing. My soul refused to be comforted. I remembered God and was troubled." Doesn't that sound like an odd statement? I remembered God and I was troubled. I complained and my spirit was overwhelmed. You know, we don't hear a lot about complaining to God. We don't talk about complaining to God. Nobody likes a complainer. I shouldn't say that. There are a lot of us that will complain, and I still like them. But nobody likes it when we complain about things. But here we have the psalmist, and this gentleman here is Jeduthun, is a gentleman who's writing this. The Bible would tell us in 1 Chronicle that the guy who wrote this is one of David's own musicians for his worship assembly, who was designated by name, according to 1 Chronicles 16, who was designated by name to give thanks to God. That's what his whole task was to constantly give thanks to God. And he writes this psalm, and he says, I complained, and my spirit was overwhelmed. My spirit is weak. I'm complaining. I'm troubled. I'm distressed. And I'm turning to you, God. Just like Jeremiah did. I'm turning to you. Today, as we walk this path of lament, and I suspect I don't want to say this is a series, but there may be more messages, and there's going to be part of this that won't be able to be drawn to a successful conclusion. But bear in mind, I preach many times over the years, and the future years hopefully, and I can give opportunity to teach more about this, but it's helped me. And I found that lament is really the only trustworthy bridge to God when we have deep seismic quakings in our life. We're going to find that man can help to an extent, but God is the ultimate one that's going to help us. When we have unbearable times of grief, when we have tremendous suffering, when we have strong disappointments and crazy frustrations in our lives, when we feel guilt or when we're angry, God provides us a path to get closer to Him. Those are the times often when I feel the most distant from God. When I'm angry about my predicament, or there's a lot of suffering, or there's a lot of pain, we can do one of two things. We can turn around and look that way where God's not, or we can turn and look toward Him. And so many people will have their faith leave them at times of deep pain, deep suffering, horrible frustrations. We've got young people today, we're going to celebrate their graduations. Young people, you're graduating from high school. It's a monumental event in your life, no doubt about it. At your age, it definitely is. When you're 57 or 8 or 9, it doesn't seem that monumental because there'll be great things that'll happen during those next 40 years. But you're going to suffer frustrations. You're going to suffer sufferings. You're going to be ostracized, hopefully, because of the things that you believe, the way you act, the way you behave. And I'm not saying that that's huge bits of suffering, but it is a level of it. And even when we have things that are small bits of suffering, sometimes you want to cry out to God, and you want Him to listen to you. And maybe you want to vent. You want to complain. Had a gentleman vent to me the other day for a little while, and it helped him. There's some benefit, there's some value to that. And there's some value in venting to God. And we'll look into that here. The specific bits of grief, a lot of people have experienced it here. I could tell you some really sad stories about my life, and you know what? If you've lived long enough, you guys can tell me some really sad stories about your life. And if you're not very old, you may not have them yet, but if you live long enough, you will. You're going to suffer. You're going to have some problem. You're going to have some pain in your life. Difficult to process, difficult to deal with. I can go through a list of these, but I'm just saying this for the purpose of letting you get a sense of what I'm talking about. When you've lost your spouse, when you lost your child, when that pregnancy doesn't work, when you have marital problems, when you have wayward children, when you have deep financial struggles, when you have issues with having no friends, or it feels that way, when that depression will just continue to linger on and on and on, and you can't sleep. You can't work your way through it. There are plenty of sad stories to tell. There's plenty of suffering going on out there. There's plenty of pain. But you know what? We're going to find as we work our way through this, you don't want to take on that suffering alone. You do not want to take it on alone. And God gives a method here to take care of this. I say take care of it, to make sure that you know that He does care, even at times when maybe it doesn't feel like He does. You know, when we have pain in our lives, man sometimes will come to us, and men and women will be well-meaning in this, when they'll say things like, this is just going to take time. Just get out of bed and put one foot in front of the other. And you've probably heard this before, is your grief will bring good to someone because in some way there'll be value in you going and experiencing this, and you'll be able to help somebody else. Or they'll say things like, it's not your fault. It is just not your fault. And in the way in which we address spirituality often has an American slant to it. Say, just get over it. Just pull yourself up and get over this. You should be able to do that. And you know, I understand these are well-meaning and well-intending. And to some degree, they're helpful. I must admit, to some degree, they're helpful. But they're not the help that God can provide to us. It doesn't really help when you're suffering to know that maybe because of all your suffering, you can help somebody else, but you know you probably will be able to. But it's not really helpful at the time you're suffering. So what is lament? Lament can be a loud cry or a howl or a passionate expression of grief. We don't hear that often in a prayer, do we? Most of the time, a lament is a prayer. We call it a lament prayer. But, you know, lament is a prayer that is going to lead us, and we're going to find this out in a while, to trusting more in God than when we first started in the prayer. It typically asks two questions. Where are you, God? And if you love me, why is this happening to me? You know, of the 150 Psalms, at least 50 of those are lament prayers. Some commentators will say half of them are, if you look at it in a certain way, but at least 50 of those, or a third of the Psalms, of the children of Israel's hymnal, if you will, they're singing a lament. And a big part of that lament is a complaint to God. With their arms extended in prayer, not like this, but like this. They're praying to God. And they're complaining to God. And they're begging God to intervene. You know, a while back I heard Brother Whitson give a prayer up here. It was very short. And it made me think. Made me think about God's intervention and why we don't ask for it more. And the prayer went something like this. It talked about our suffering. There are many people here that are suffering. God, we know that you care. Why don't you intervene? Where are you? How come you're not here? Why are you not intervening? And you know, I thought about that. And what he was doing, he was praying a lament. And at the end of his prayer, he brought it back around in just a short sentence about trusting in God. Let thy will be done, because we trust in you. Let thy will be done. Lament is how we can grieve as Christians. We lament to grieve and yet still trust. We grieve while we struggle and yet believe. And it's how we bring our sorrows before God. It sure beats being silent with those struggles. Because if we don't turn to God, where are we going to turn? So let's walk through this path today. And if you'll bear with me a little bit, some of this is a little bit uncomfortable for me to say. It seems like I'm maybe being a little too accusatory of God. I think if you'll bear with me for a while, we'll get to a point where it doesn't feel that way. So bear with me during this time for a while. After the reading up there, and I don't have it on PowerPoint, but verses 4, which follow behind this, it says in chapter 77 of Psalm, says, "You hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I have considered the days of old, the years of anxious time. I call to remembrance my song in the night. I meditate within my heart, and my spirit makes diligent search." The psalmist doesn't know how to deal with this. I remember my song in the night. I'm meditating within my heart. Those are paths forward, no doubt. But then he says, and my spirit makes diligent search. Other translations will say, my spirit caused me to ask. It caused me to ask questions. And look at these questions. There are 6 questions here. And these 6 questions are found in Psalm 77 and verse 7. It says, will the Lord cast off forever? Will he be favorable no more? Has his mercy ceased forever? Has his promise failed forevermore? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in his anger shut up his tender mercies? This is written by the guy who was designated by name to always give thanks to the Lord. What are these questions here? Look at them. Will the Lord cast off forever? Is he not going to be favorable anymore to me? Has he forgotten me? Will he spurn me forever? Do you think the psalmist really believed this? I suspect he doesn't believe this, but lament indeed centers around our deep central need for the presence of God to be felt by us. His perceived absence here is at the heart of the psalmist's concern. If God isn't loving, doesn't keep his promises, then obviously we're serving the wrong God. So the psalmist doesn't believe this. But he's offering a prayer here that recognizes his pain and his suffering. And in the emotion of that pain and suffering, he has feelings, he has emotions that really aren't based on truth anymore, but they feel nonetheless true. These things feel true. And as we continue in our Christian walk, there's oftentimes when our emotion gets the best of us. And we think things that aren't true may be true. Things such as this. And we begin to think they're true. You know what? We won't look to God anymore. But every time we have a lament, with the exception of one chapter, that's Psalm the 88th chapter, you can read it on your own time, we have a turning back to God. And I will suggest to you today, that's the intent of this offering of sadness and sorrow to God, this complaint that we have to God. There's a quote from a gentleman there. It says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. There's a megaphone in our ear when we have suffering. We can continue to live in the American spirituality of the pursuit of happiness and shake our fists at suffering and say, well, it won't come, it won't come. But if we're going to endure this walk, there's going to be suffering. And when we have that suffering, there's going to be shouting in our ear. And you know what? It rouses us to do certain things. And it rouses the psalmist here to be very intent on his prayer life and continuing to get closer to God. As odd as that sounds, that is indeed what happens. Look what he does here in 77 verse 10. And I said, this is my anguish. My anguish is coming from the fact that I feel cast off, that you're not favorable. Your mercy has ceased. Your promise has failed. I've been forgotten. You're angry with me, Lord. But look what he remembers here. He says, but. You know, you hear a lot of preachers get up and talk about this but yet or however, and I'll call it for sake of being correct or politically correct, I'll say the yet bridge. There's a yet bridge here. There's a however bridge. A bridge that takes us from the cul-de-sac of sorrows or the cul-de-sac of complaints where things just pull there, that's a repository for our complaints. There's a bridge that leads us somewhere else. Or there's a pathway. It doesn't stay there. Our complaints don't stay there. They move on somewhere. This is a journey that takes us closer to God. And so he says, but I remember the years of the right hand of the Most High, the powerful right hand of God. I remember when I saw the Red Seas parted. I saw when you delivered us out of slavery, or at least I can remember in my mind's eye, as he says. I can remember the wonderful things you did with your great right hand and the power that you showed to us or displayed to us. I will remember the works of the Lord. Surely I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on all your works and talk of your deeds. So he complains. He turns to God. He complains. And all of a sudden there's a bridge that leads him to an expression of trust in God as he reflects on what God has done for him. And you'll see this is a recurring theme in this process. And we're going to walk through this process for a few of these. Lament shows us how to live between, it fills in the gap, I guess, between the hard life that we have oftentimes and God's goodness. And in the middle there is times when we can offer up a lament to God. We can offer up these type of prayers to God. It's an opportunity to remind our hearts about God's faithfulness in the past while still in pain. And reminds our heart of what we know to be true, not how we feel about things. Let's look at Psalms, the 10th chapter for a moment. Another complaint to God here by the psalmist. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I'll have to look at this one. I don't have a Bible up here, but I think this one's written by David. It says, why do you stand afar off, O Lord? Why do you hide in times of trouble? Why do you stand afar off? Why do you hide in times of trouble? You ever think about God hiding from us? It's crazy to think that, isn't it? But in our despair, in our struggle, in our heartache, sometimes we'll feel like he's a long ways away. Again, I say that. And the psalmist feels the same way. Is this relatable? If it's relatable, should these feelings just be dismissed as, that's not going to happen? Or are they part of a journey to something more important to us and more important to God and having that communication with God? I don't think we would have 50 of these psalms written if they weren't meant for us to either repeat them, either from reading them and saying them aloud, or repeat this process. Why do you hide from me in times of trouble, O Lord? You know, when we have unfulfilled desires, disappointments, you don't get that job offer. And I'm not going to trivialize this. It seems like I am. But everybody, in their own sensitivities, finds suffering in different points in their life. And up until the time you have a major setback in life, those aren't trivial. Those are your sufferings. Those are your pains. A get over it doesn't work most of the time. When you're lonely, when you have an old, ailing body, and as the prayer was suggested today by Brother Jonathan, when your body's not going to last much longer, that's suffering. When you have unfair people that supervise you, When you, again, as I say, have marital issues, a lot of those things are unseen, but they bring suffering to you. You know, you look at, and we'll go through a few of these right quick. You know, there's a time in which we have why questions. This is a why question here. Why do you stand afar off? Psalms 21 and 22 and 1 says, my God, why have you forsaken me? You know who's saying that? It's David. Jesus quotes that when he's on the cross. Sometimes we may have a misunderstanding of that. I did a few years ago. This is David saying this, and Jesus is quoting this. When he's on the cross, David is feeling a distance from God. Long before Jesus felt that as he was dying on the cross. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? Look at Psalm 44 and 23. It says, awake, why do you sleep, O Lord? Arise, do not cast us off forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our affliction and our oppression? Why, God? Psalm 88 would say, Lord, why do you cast off my soul? Why do you hide your face from me? There's a lot of hiding going on here, isn't it? There's a lot of struggle to see Jesus in the pain, or in this instance, see God in the pain. There's a lot of desire to see God intervene. God, why don't you fix this? You can. You have the power to do it. Why don't you fix this? There's a lot of how questions too. Psalm 13 would say, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? Psalm 35 would say, Lord, how long will you look on? Rescue me from their destructions, my precious life from the lion. Psalm 74 would say, oh God, how long will the adversary reproach? Will the enemy blaspheme your name forever? Lord, how long will the wicked triumph? We sit back and see that in our corporate prayers today. We'll sit back and say, Lord, how long are you going to let this country do what's going on in this country? How long will you see evil triumph? How long will you see us sit in the shadows and not be able to come out because we're so fearful? How long, O Lord? Why aren't you going to manifest yourself and take care of this? And you know what? These heartfelt questions have been in the Bible all along, but I miss those. I've missed them until now. And there's obviously, because they're listed here and they're written in Psalm, there's great value in bringing these questions to God. And the Psalms, to some degree, give us permission, even encouragement, to lay out our struggles. Just like we vent to our fellow man, there's a time and a place to vent to God. Not to accuse him, not to attack him, but to say, I'm struggling, God. And I'm struggling because I don't feel your presence. And this may make us uncomfortable when we hear things like this. Let's look at the remaining part of Psalm, the 10th chapter. Read verse 1. It says, why do you stand afar off, O Lord? Why do you hide in times of trouble? The wicked in his pride persecutes the poor. Let them be caught in their plots which they have devised. Talking about the wicked here. We see wicked all around us. For the wicked boasts of his heart's desire. He blesses the greedy and renounces the Lord. They talk about all the things they want. We see that a lot in this culture. He renounces the Lord. The wicked in his proud countenance does not seek God. God is in none of his thoughts. Have you seen people that look down upon God? We see it all the time. And that's what that means. In his proud countenance, that means he's looking down. He's looking down his nose at God. God isn't even in his thoughts. Verse 5, it says, his ways are always prospering. Isn't that how it works? The wicked seem like they've got everything going for them. They succeed. From a point of suffering, that's how it looks. Your judgments are far above, out of his sight. As for all of his enemies, he sneers at them. He has said in his heart, I shall not be moved. I shall never be in adversity. His mouth is full of cursing and deceit and oppression. Under his tongue is trouble and iniquity. He sits in the lurking places of the villages. In secret places he murders the innocent. His eyes are secretly fixed on the helpless. He lies and waits secretly as a lion in his den. He lies in wait to catch the poor. He catches the poor when he has drawn him into his net. So he crouches. He lies low, that the helpless may fall by his strength. And so what does the wicked man, what does the oppressive man conclude here? He says, God has forgotten. He hides his face. He will never see. The proud man thinks the same thing that the godly man thinks. Where are you, God? He's hiding. He's hiding. That's what he thinks. In Hebrews, the 4th chapter, verse 15, the Bible reads, For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we, yet without sin. Does Jesus understand this struggle? Does he understand, if you will, if you'll allow me, feelings of occasional doubt, of despair? Maybe I shouldn't throw doubt in there. I don't think Jesus ever doubted. But you know what? Complaining can't just end in complaining. We can't wallow in our questions or our frustrations. It's part of the journey, the path to healing that brings us closer to him. And part of that is to ask boldly of him. And here's the process of lament. If you read through the lament Psalms, most of them work this way. They work in this order. Most of them have to deal with turning to God. That means asking God, complaining to God. And I should have flip-flopped ask and trust. But you ask God for something, mainly intervene to help. And then it turns around that you trust him because you reflect on what he's done, the fact that he's delivered us before. And that's how all of these work, with the exception of a couple. Sometimes they put them in a different order. Sometimes you'll hear the trust come first. But there is a purpose in this process. It doesn't just end with complaint. There's value in this. There is value in this. And you know, I don't want to give a personal testimony up here, but I guess I will. I've done this for the last several weeks. And you know what? It helps. It helps. When I wasn't turning to God with my pain, I couldn't find any help. When I started complaining to God, I recognized in some complaints they're very trivial. Some of them are not. They can rule your life. But it taught me who to turn back to. If you can't pray this prayer on your own, pray these Psalms. Pray Psalm 77. Pray Psalm 10. Pray the 13th Psalm. Pray this Psalm right here, Psalm 22. They're there for a reason. And there's great value in them. If you can read that, Psalm 22 says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but you do not hear. And in the night season, and am not silent. But you are holy, enthroned in the praises of Israel. Our fathers trusted in you. They trusted in you, delivered them. They cried to you and were delivered. They trusted in you and were not ashamed. You see that bridge in verse 3. There's a but there. This is how I feel, God. I don't feel that you're around. I don't feel that you care. You've forsaken me. But I'm thinking about something here when I feel that way. Remember that the next time you start doubting about God, whether or not he cares. There's a but here. But what? You are holy. You're enthroned in the praises of Israel. Our fathers trusted in you. You know what? And you delivered them. I'm going to bank on that. I'm going to remember that. I'm going to hold you to that, God. I'm going to make sure you deliver me, God. I'm not going to continue to complain over and over and over. I'm going to believe in that. And I'm going to have faith in that. It goes on a little bit farther in that chapter and says, again in verse 9, but you are he who took me out of the womb. You made me trust while in my mother's breast. I was cast upon you from birth. From my mother's womb, you have been my God. It's going from the me to you. I'm concerned about myself, God. Let me reflect on you for a while. Skipping down to verse 19, and for time's sake, we'll do that. Won't read 11 through 18. It says, but you, O Lord, do not be far from me. O my strength, hasten to help me. Deliver me from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth and from the horns of the wild oxen. You know, do we have to worry about dogs and wild oxen and things of this nature? No. But our suffering feels like we've got the world attacking us. We feel like we're being overcome by that. This psalm is a psalm that we can read. This psalm is a psalm that we can pray. This is a psalm that will make us quit focusing, and I don't want to say completely not focus on our suffering, because our suffering is meaningful. But it'll make us also reorient our thought process here to start thinking about Him and what He has done and how meaningful He is to us. And what can we ask for? Psalms 10 and 12. Arise, O Lord, O God, lift up your hand. Do not forget the humble. Rise up, God, fix this. Psalm 16:11 tells us that give us help from trouble, for the help of man is useless. They'll give a little bit of comfort, but they can't give the comfort that God can. Help us, God. Bring justice. A couple of these are going to make you uncomfortable, so bear that in mind. Psalms 83, verse 16 says, fill their faces with shame that they may seek your name, O Lord. Let them be confounded and dismayed forever. Yes, let them be put to shame and perish. And in the instance where we've had issues of our own sin cause us or put us in these moments of despair, we beg His forgiveness. Psalm 51 and 1 would say, blot out my transgressions. We're told we ask God to be restored. Psalm 80 and 3 says, restore us, O God. Restore us, O God. Restore my soul. Restore my marriage. Restore my family. We let God teach us in times of pain. That's when we open up our heart and know that God is good and He can teach us. It's an opportunity for growth or it's an opportunity for withdrawal, and we should choose growth at these times. And in the end, vengeance is going to be God's. But you know, we can pray to some degree for vindication. Psalm 35 and 23 would say, stir up yourself and awake to my vindication, to my cause, my God and my Lord. Vindicate me, O Lord my God, according to your righteousness, and let them not rejoice over me. NIV would say, rise to my defense, contend for me, vindicate me, clear my name, show the wicked. Can we ask for that? I suspect we can. We have to be very careful about how we ask for that. You know, I started with the 77th Psalm, and I didn't finish it, but we'll finish it here. We're talking about trusting in God. After reading the portion of the 77th Psalm we read earlier, there was a lot of issues with whether or not God was there. The 6 questions we read earlier, whether He was wayward, whether He cared, whether He wanted to be a part of us. And then this chapter right here ends in this way. Shows you that he starts with complaint. He asks God, and then he shows his expression of trust for God. And look what expression of trust, what he uses here to show that he is trusting in God. It says, the water saw you, O God, the water saw you. They were afraid. The depths also trembled. The clouds poured out water. The sky sent out a sound. Your arrows also flashed about. The voice of your thunder was in the whirlwind. The lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. What is he talking about here? Verse 19 tells us, and your way was in the sea, your path in the great waters, and your footsteps were not known. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. You see what the psalmist ended this lament with? He anchored his complaints, his questioning, his hurting heart to the single greatest redemptive event in the life of Israel. He anchored it on that. The exodus from Egypt was the anchor for his weary soul. That's what caused him to trust in God, because he is trustworthy. Lord, I'm trusting you to keep me trusting. I've seen you before. I've seen what you've done. I know how you operate. And I remember that. For us today, the Exodus event, or the place we find deliverance, is at the cross of Christ. Romans 8. Apostle Paul writes here, he says, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? As it is written, for your sake we are killed all the day long. We are accounted as sheep for the slaughter. Quoting a lament, Psalm 44. We're going through all this struggle, all these problems, and we're just counted as just sheep for the struggle, or to be slaughtered. We're struggling sheep. We're just here to be slaughtered, right? But look what happens directly before this verse. Verse 28 says, and we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. What shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He's trusting in God. He trusts God before he says this, and you know what? He trusts God after he says this too. In a very familiar passage in Romans 8 and 37, he says, yet in all these things, in all the suffering, in all the turmoil, in all the pain that we have in our life, we're more than conquerors. Why? Because of him, because of Jesus, because he loves us. And he is persuaded that neither all these sufferings, death, life, nor angels, nor principalities, or powers, all these things shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Paul takes the reality of suffering, pain, and combines them to highlight the promises of God's love. And that's an example of trusting in God. And that's where our lament should end. And trust me, it works. If you haven't prayed it, it works. The psalmist wouldn't have put this in the Bible if it did not work. And it does work. Lament is how you live life when it's hard. And it's the gap that fills over to trusting in his promises. That's what lament does. It's a process that gets you to recognize and to trust in him. Turn to God. Complain to him. Don't let it in there. Ask God. Ask him to fix it. And then trust in God. I shall look at the world through tears. Perhaps I shall see things that dry-eyed I could not see. I hate to say this, but just maybe there's some purpose in that pain. Maybe it'll make you wiser, sharper, closer to each other, to God. Just maybe it will. There is some purpose in that pain. Don't let it just sit there and make you angrier and turn away from God. Use it to the glory of God in that it brings you closer to God. As hard as it is to do. Read those Psalms. Pray those psalms and believe. Give ear, O Lord, to my prayer, and attend to the voice of my supplications. In the day of my trouble, I will call upon you, for you will answer me. In the end, that's the end of a lamentation prayer. That's the end of that lament. You'll answer me, God. You'll be there, God. You'll help me, God. Dark times may come upon us, and dark times have a way of shaking our faith. Once we survive the initial shock, let it shake you into a deeper trust for God. Let it draw you near. Let it make you feel the presence of God in your life. Don't let emotion take a hold of you and make you think that he doesn't care, he's not near. That's not trusting in God. That's trusting in your emotions. I've been there. I know how that feels. You have too. This morning, if you're in need of the prayers of this congregation, we'll offer a lament on your behalf. We'll beg God to intervene in your life. We'll beg for God for you to feel the presence of God in your life, where you won't have to endure this in your own mind alone. If you are subject to the gospel call this morning, make your wishes known this morning with us. Let us know, and we'll help you and we'll accommodate that need too. And please, if you have any other need, make them known right now as we rise and stand and sing the song of invitation.